So the art of value stacking behind the meter. I'm Julia Piper, Senior Editor, Green Tech Media. I'm joined here with Martin Milani, CEO of SunVerge, Chadwick Manning, co-founder and CEO of Electric Power, and Giovanni D'Amato, Senior Project Manager at EPRI. To kick things off, I wanted to give a couple stats on the behind-the-meter energy storage industry. In the US, it had a record-breaking quarter in Q2. There were 32 megawatt hours of capacity deployed in the US. There was a dip in Q3, and overall the market remains small according to GTM research numbers. So we're talking about a really small market today. However, by 2021, GTM research expects behind-the-meter storage to make up half of the annual market. So by that time, this will be a $1.2 billion market. Behind-the-meter storage will make up half of that. Residential, 38% of that. So huge growth potential, and yet it remains small today. And the financing side of this is really key here. How do you get financiers to monetize different value streams? The value stacking question. So I guess to kick things off, we're going to have our speakers tell us a little bit more about what they do. Let's actually start on the far side. Giovanni, tell us more about your role at EPRI, but then get into that storage valuation tool that you guys offer that addresses stacking specifically.
Sure. At EPRI, there's many programs, if you're familiar with the Institute, but I'm focused on energy storage and more specifically the valuation or analysis of energy storage for utilities and other projects. And what Julia just mentioned was I'm also the product manager for StorageVet, which is an EPRI tool that was funded by the California Energy Commission. It's free to the public, and really the focus of it is on really the title of this presentation, and it's to value energy storage providing either a single service or stacked services. So it's a co-optimization tool that's web-based and project-specific. And we're using the tool to help member utilities at EPRI understand value stacking of energy storage, as well as providing the tool itself to the public, to everybody here, all stakeholders from vendors to regulators to utilities.
Great. Chad, tell us a bit more about Electric, what you guys are all about, and what kind of use cases you're seeing for your technology today.
Sure. My name is Chadwick Manning. I'm the co-founder CEO of Electric, and we've developed an all-in-one energy storage management and monitoring system for homes and small businesses. And a lot of the use cases we're seeing today are Puerto Rico is a huge market for us. We also see developers as a very large market for ourselves. Our technology is very focused on, and we have a lot of the value proposition over our competitors in those markets because of the ease of installation and the energy management services that we provide. We see the energy storage system as really a vehicle into that home, whereas we'll build other services on top of that, whether that's providing software as a service to those homeowners or grid services in some cases, depending on what markets we're in, what the use cases are, what the needs are of those homeowners or small businesses.
Great. Martin, you were recently named CEO of SunVerge. Tell us a little bit more about SunVerge and maybe your vision for the company in their new role.
Well, from our inception, we had always thought that at some point energy storage or DERs, whether you're talking about storage or PV, at some point are going to become grid scale assets, and they're going to be sort of get integrated into the smart grid. That's what we thought, years ago, and we still strongly believe in that. And what we, obviously what we do is we had we were in the space of pairing energy storage with PV years ago. I had an integrated stack and a software control and management system to control that. We have had capabilities to do grid services as well as demand side services or consumer type services from our inception. and also sort of kind of curtailing other devices loads within a home. We are a residential play, we are a behind the meter play, but the ability to also control addressable load and sort of kind of optimize the addressable load with storage, with PV, and have the ability to co-optimize between grid services and consumer services, something we've done from our inception, and we're going to continue to do so.
Great. Let's just address the elephant in the room. Does value stacking even matter? Like, is anyone doing it today? Is this just a buzzword that no one's really put much value behind at this point? Does someone want to take that on in a real way?
Yeah, a lot of people are actually doing it. It's mostly in the forms of pilots. I mean, in order to do value stacking, I mean, yeah, solar aggregators aren't doing any value stacking. That shouldn't be a surprise, but you know, they would like to do that. And I can certainly tell you that most of them are trying to figure out how to do it. Utilities, you know, I can just tell you personally, just in the last 90 days, we've probably seen about more than a dozen RFPs specifically to offer grid services over storage. So this is, you know, it's very real. We also have had quite a few pilots in the last 3 or 4 years that are doing exactly that. Is it happening at scale? Not yet. Does any utility have, you know, 400,000 below the meter storage devices that are running frequency rec or volt var on? No. Will they be doing that? Well, from where I sit, absolutely. I mean, they are spending a lot of money on these RFPs. They're trying to figure out what's the best way to do this. This is exactly how utilities operate. You know, you do pilots, you figure it out. That's exactly what happened with smart meters and so on and so forth. And we think the tipping point, we're pretty close to the tipping point on that.
You want to add anything on that?
Well, Martin's 100% correct, is that most utilities are at a pilot stage right now. But there's other value to be had at different levels of the food chain, whether it's the solar installers or distributors or the homeowners themselves or even small business owners in our case, or even developers for that matter, whether it's being able to provide grid services in capacity manner, or it's being able to provide additional services, whether it's security or fire detection or anything else that you can integrate into a smart home platform. That's the way that we really are looking at it, is we're looking at this being the vehicle into that home, and it's sitting at the center of where energy is being produced and consumed. Being able to do that, being able to control the energy of the other smart appliances or having other smart plugs that are connected to our system, we're able to provide a much more holistic experience that doesn't affect the behavior of those customers, but provides them the security and knowledge that their home is running as efficiently as possible.
Giovanni.
I was just going to say, in our experience, I haven't seen, I don't know of a single project that we have live going on right now with utilities where we're not looking at more than one benefit to stack for a particular storage system or a set of storage projects.
We talked about that platform you have. I think you mentioned there's some 240 companies or institutions using the EPRI tool on value stacking. What is proving to be the most attractive value in there? I'm imagining there's a customer bill savings element, but then what's after that?
Right. Well, focusing just on the customer side of the meter projects, still what we're seeing with the utilization of the tool and the user feedback is that there is a big focus still on the conventional bill savings. We have probably demand charge savings for commercial customers in high demand charge states like California and New York. There's also time of use energy, those two together as well. And then from there, moving on to less conventional stacking. So having that bill savings as an anchor service, and then adding on to that maybe participation in other programs like demand response, if you're just looking at a single customer, or from the utility perspective, if you add that kind of joint control where the utility also has access to the storage system at the customer site, then there's a myriad of other services to consider, such as distribution, upgrade deferrals, voltage support, power quality and reliability issues.
So why do utilities want behind-the-meter storage, which is what we're specifically talking about here, instead of just putting their own system that they can totally control at the distribution level? Does anyone want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Well, having a distributed network of energy storage systems is a much more efficient way of doing it. It also ensures that utilities have a piece of hardware within those homes for an extended period of time. We're seeing solar companies coming in and taking their customers. And so having a embedded device that they can offer services on top of what their typical energy services that they provide allows them to have a much more effective role within those homeowners' lives. So they're not going to be kicked out over a small period of time if they have one of these energy storage systems, because they're lasting 10 to 20 years. And having that security makes a big difference for these guys.
Martin, do you have anything to add on that? Why utilities?
A couple, probably echoing some of the things that Chad said. One is customer engagement. Utilities have been trying to figure out how to engage customer in a long-running transaction and relationship beyond just sending a bill once a month. So this is actually an extremely interesting way of getting. There were talks of utilities trying to offer internet services and things like that 15, 20 years ago. But this actually matters because this is very close to what the utility does, which is provide power and electricity. So one is customer engagement. Another one is the ability to actually manage the grid in a far more effective way, in a far more efficient way. You can actually use storage devices as sensors at the end of the line. You can actually control them. You can get, you can get millisecond responses if you want for grid services type of operations like frequency regulation and voltage regulation, et cetera. So you could really start doing this. But probably most importantly, this is a consumer trend. This is a consumer trend that started without much of the utility being involved. And this trend is continuing. So the utility needs to understand and how to benefit from this consumer trend, and which this consumer trend is also having an effect on the utility distribution grid itself. It's making it unstable. It's making it, you have reverse flows. It's doing all sorts of things to the distribution grid that the utility doesn't like. So how does the utility actually jump in there and manage this? So again, even to the utility, it has consumer-centric value. To the demand-side management folks, it has a consumer-centric value. And it has value to the grid management folks. And often so far, at least till recently, these two groups inside the utility haven't talked too much. But now they're actually talking specifically for the same reasons.
So the value stacking for behind-the-meter storage is kind of stemming from DERs themselves. They are creating the values because it's disrupting the system. Sounds as though the utility might not necessarily want to go this route if they weren't sort of being coerced into it.
It's exactly right. And the other part is resiliency, and that's one thing that we haven't really focused on today. We do a lot of business down in Puerto Rico, and there isn't a grid for 60% of the people that are down there. You're still grid tied, but you don't have power, or you're using a generator for 18 hours a day, and you're spending $1,000 to $2,000 a month on diesel. And when the alternative, it's become less of a nice to have and more of a must have now. The rate of return on a system like that is looking more of around 2.5 to 3 years rather than, and that's for a full solar storage and generator option, which we're really one of the only systems out there that works with a diesel generator inverter that's inverter based.
I'm going to pause you 1 second. Can people hear him okay? Or should we try and turn it up a little bit? Is it okay?
You can hear it?
Okay, great.
All right.
Perfect.
So I could speak a little bit louder, but at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is create an ecosystem that enables people to have power. That is one of the reasons why I started this business, was to really give people power without power. It's one of the things that GTM or Navigant, everything doesn't really focus on when they're talking about the market size. They don't look at the variables outside of just the economics and the amount of solar that's being put out there. And trying to determine that, it's a much more difficult process than I could ever try to estimate. But and I give credit to you guys for that. But I believe that this market is a lot bigger than we're even estimating. Having a resilient platform of independence from a utility strikes a chord with most people. And the more doomsday preppers that are out there, or the people that just don't necessarily believe that there's going to be a power source that is reliable during these hurricanes and natural disasters, the more people that are going to buy it because, for example, one of our customers loses $500 worth of food every single time his power goes out because it's in an area where he doesn't have a reliable power source, and that's why he's buying one of our systems. There's other economic factors that aren't being pulled into these models that are really pushing the market to move in a way where there's more attention to it. And no slight against you guys, but
No, that's a fair point. Were you going to add something on that, Martin?
Well, I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, you're absolutely right. And first of all, there are societal benefits that people are responding to, and that's being, obviously more environmental friendly. And that's something that if you actually look at the demographics, typically people under 30 and even under 40 are respond to that quite a bit, even though there might not be some economical incentive in it for them. So people, there's a lot of reaction to that. But from also a resiliency perspective, that's something that's often not talked about. That's something that often, a value has not been, is not a specific value is not put on resiliency or having backup power. But KD, is something that's pretty important to a lot of utilities. You can get fined quite a bit. Where if you have blackouts that are over a period of time, and also what's really important is most people actually live on feeders on our radial networks that actually are cut easily. That's very different than having storage on a substation. Typically, when there's storms or earthquakes or fires or things like that, people that are living on radial networks, when there's a cut, there goes the line, and it's having that resiliency in that matter actually matters a lot, and it's something that's meaningful, very meaningful to consumers. People pay a lot of money for insurance, and they might have an accident once every 5 years, but they still pay, and this is something that I think not talked about often.
Look what's happening in Santa Barbara. They don't have any power.
Where, sorry?
Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara,
The
yeah.
fires, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to, tie it all together that just given having DERs as a given and the bigger and more extreme storm events coming more often, energy storage as a DER itself is really it's a key asset in that mix to really bind everything together and to make it work. In terms of, even if it's for the utility to help with increasing hosting capacity of DERs and also improving on the customer resiliency or reliability.
I feel like, we do talk about it at GTM and other places. It seems like a lot of the behind the meter selling point is that emotional feeling of backup power, which, as we understand it, that's not necessarily a mass scale market at today's prices. You have to be able to invest in that. So that's where the value stacking comes back in.
One thing that I would bring up is, what do you see on a return for a generator? And do people buy them?
Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to displace the generator market, then
it's not just generator market. It's you're creating a no maintenance, renewable energy resource for it that is giving you an indefinite amount of power when it's tied to solar.
I'm pushing back purely for the sake of conversation.
Of course, and I'll push back the same way.
Well, I'll add to that though. So how do you have the conversation with the customer? If they're these, as you mentioned, off-grid kind of people, they want resiliency, independence from the utility, and you're saying, great, we'll give you all that. By the way, the utility is going to control this whenever they really need it. Seems like those are two different kinds of conversations to be having specifically with like a residential customer.
Just like with anyone, you incentivize them.
So how do you do that?
You pay them.
So that'll overcome the emotional independence
Well,
motivation?
I mean, you give them through software and control, you make sure that they have enough backup power in case if you can predict those outages or bad weather events to make sure that the battery isn't being sucked out by the utility during those events. But during high demand response events where they necessarily don't need that power, you are able to provide those grid services and incentivize them by giving them a rate higher than the retail rate and letting them share with the profits. So they don't feel like you're just stealing from them, which they've purchased this asset, they've invested in it, and they need to be made felt like they've had they've had some say in whether that system is going to provide those grid services. And most people want to help stabilize the grid. And if you push it into that direction and frame it in that context, it makes a big difference.
Which I guess gets into the question of how are customers comfortable then paying up front for something that the utility will benefit from on the customer's investment? Or will they say, hey, every time the utility uses this, it kind of degrades my battery a little bit, and shouldn't I be getting paid extra for that? Or how do you start to splice all the economics on all of that?
How do you splice it?
Well, I mean, I think that energy storage does introduce, some complex business models or arrangements. When you start talking about joint control, where the utility uses it sometimes for, let's say a deferral on the distribution system versus the customer using it for reducing their bills. Or in some cases, always having it for backup, something there in reserve for backup power. And I think the business models we're seeing, they're definitely being explored. They're pretty nascent at this point, but there's a lot of flexibility out there. I think storage offers that flexibility, and over the next few years, we'll be definitely working out with pilots with customers and with the utilities testing some of those models to see how these things fall out and what are the various price points that are necessary to drive that type of adoption with customers and with the utilities.
And obviously one form of a behavioral intervention is pricing and having the kind of tariffs, like dynamic pricing, time of use, so on and so forth, and you bundle that with storage, it could be a rebate. I mean, utilities spend about in North America somewhere around $10 billion a year doing EE rebates, storage is one of those things that gives you base load, it gives you peak load at the same time off the same device, and it can give you multi kind of measure. Sort of kind of like a system type, load shape type, savings, because it affects whatever measures you have in the home. It's not a measure specific that, hey, if you just do lighting, this means you can curtail from this hour to that hour. So I think it's a pretty interesting device, and while paired with PV, that can give you quite a bit. And I think utilities will be, figure out a different ways of getting the consumer to adopt that. And I don't think that's going to be that difficult. But I think also it's worth mentioning that the prices will come down. I mean, there was a time where an 8086, for some of us that are that old, we know how old those computers are, cost $6,000. And when people said that everybody's gonna have a computer at home, people laughed at that because, oh, it's not economical, it's crazy. And not only we have 17 computers at home, but we probably have a bunch of phones. Same thing with cell phones. I mean, when Apple came out and said there was, iPhone was gonna be like $1,000, who the hell is gonna use that? The rest of the industry was actually going towards building very cheap phones, $50 phones, Ericsson and Nokia. And by providing this sort of services, now everybody, even in China, people are spending $1,000 on an iPhone device. So it's sort of not it's not super clear at this time, but that doesn't mean it won't be clear in a few years, and the prices will come down just like anything else. They're going to be as these things get produced more, the prices will come down just like flat panel TVs did, and just like electrical cars, EVs will, and have.
There's 25 gigawatt factories that are being built across the globe right now that are that will come online here at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And while battery prices are stagnant, probably for the next year, coming down a little bit, but there's a huge demand for EVs, which is really driving that demand. But the supply will be there, and that curve is going to hit that plus the regulations that are coming into effect, whether it's Rule 21 or the other economic incentives with SGIP or other state incentives at that level, and even the federal ITC, hopefully if it stays around. But that plus the cost coming down, plus regulations around net energy metering changing and hedging against that, it's going to bring a perfect kind of storm for energy storage to become very economical and make a lot of sense. But right now, there's no question about it. At behind the meter residential level, in a lot of markets, there's some markets that it does make sense. People are doing this because they want the independence, resiliency. They want the ability to show it off to their friends. They want the coolness factor of it. They want to be economic and green from that perspective. And that's just where we're at. But to Marin's point, all of that's changing. We're living in a world where the economics are changing every single year. And new markets open up every single year, like with Arizona just this last year, with demand charges coming into play. I mean, this is not a this is a very dynamic market. It continues changing, and new areas are opening up every single day.
If I were to just add something, $6,000 in 1980, by the way, was a lot of money.
So it seems like maybe value stacking won't even be as maybe necessary as part of the financing conversation as I initially suggested once these prices come down. Do you think it will be just for purely system reasons, or will value stacking be less important for behind the meter?
I think you need to be value stacking to be competitive. I think the market's going to determine what value you need to provide to be competitive in a market that, at the residential level, there's not many of us, but at the commercial level, there's many, many players. And if you're not value stacking, then you're not going to be providing the value that the market's demanding.
I would, sticking with the cell phone theme, if we just keep to energy storage doing one anchor service, it would be like using our $1,000 iPhones just to make phone calls.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Same.
This is a vehicle.
Energy storage is the iPhone of the home.
This is, and that's
Or business. We heard that here.
When you interviewed me, a year and a half ago, that's what I said, is that our system was, we look at this as the iPhone, is that we're going in and providing a vehicle into that home, and we're writing software on top of it to provide all these different services and solutions. And that is really what energy storage is. It's a long-term vehicle into that home to be able to provide all of these other services, whether it's to the grid, to the solar installers, or to the customer, the end user.
I'm going to get to some customer questions. I want to ask you, Martin, to, well, add whatever you were going to just say, plus talk about this TEPCO deal that was just announced, I think, today, or yesterday, actually.
What I wanted to say is there is actually, so this is a little bit of a chicken and egg story. You do need the penetration of these things out there so they can be farmed in order to actually provide the service and provide the, actually, I guess, take the value out. I mean, there are, obviously, asset deferral is very real. A lot of utilities are doing it. Just a few months ago, BPA, Bonneville Power, actually, avoided building a 500-mile transmission line over about $500 million due to energy efficiency, demand response, and renewables. So that's very real. And then you have also the operations of a distribution grid. There's typically, I mean, people say about 6% line loss is probably, that's average. They're all over the place, probably around the country, and far worse in the world. But if you take 6% line loss on the distribution grids across the country and you bring that down to 4%, that's a hell of a lot of value. If you actually cut down the number of blackouts, that's a lot of value. And so there is a ton of value that is out there. It just needs to sort of kind of, you need to deploy, then you actually look at the, extracting the value. With respect to TEPCO, this is basically what's really interesting about that project is the ability to basically have a multi-site organization and manage that multi-site organization as a single organization that's dispersed across Tokyo in this case, and have the ability to sort of kind of maintain that and sort of kind of curtail them in a way that you look at them as a single node, and you manage them as a single node, yet these are distributed sites. And if one site is you're managing each site to the most optimum way, but if actually it's one site cannot curtail as much as it was supposed to, you actually see if you can borrow from another site who has that capacity available. This itself is creating a sort of a kind of a virtual nanogrid, and it is in a way probably a first step towards what people call, sort of, I don't want to use blockchain, but transactive energy, or the ability to actually, trade power.
Great, thank you for that. I wanted to touch on the newsy element. Turning to some of these questions, so let's start with this one. If a secondary value stream is essential to feasibility but also volatile, what's the standard for accommodating that risk?
Going back to the tool I mentioned at the beginning, so StorageVet can help with that by building out scenarios. So I would say, you might have an anchor service. We were talking about, demand charge management. That's fairly stable. We know the direction that demand charges are going, and it's usually up. But if you're trying to add on, let's say, frequency regulation and going into the market, we saw in New Jersey how that's kind of gone up and down. It's pretty volatile here in California as well. So one way is to look at, over time, what are the scenarios. It's also thinking about, storage is flexible, so you don't need to necessarily lock yourself in for the full life of the project to providing that 1 second benefit. Today, it's frequency regulation. 2 years down the road, it could be flexible ramping. It could be something different, negative prices in the market because we go to a 50 or a higher percent RPS, things like that.
Great. This next question's it's a pretty big one, but if everyone could give maybe one example, I think that'd be interesting. So how are different states or RSOs, ISOs, RTOs tackling the challenge of storage systems providing services to multiple parties? I'm thinking of CAISO has their just aggregated just DER research that they're doing. Obviously, there's pilots in California. I think PJM is doing some as well. What comes to mind for you guys, and could you describe it? Martin, do you want to give us an example?
Ooh, well, obviously New York. Again, I think this is this is going to continue to evolve. And I think, the ability to actually provide the capacity back into the market, right now there's obviously some minimums that could change. And I think, what comes to mind is obviously what's going on in New York, what's going on at PJM, what's going on in California is in fact the ability to do frequency regulation and the ability to do voltage regulation. I mean, we're seeing it. We're also seeing it in Arizona. We're also, one other state that sort of escapes me right now. But they are. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, those 3 states are pretty far advanced in doing exactly that.
I just want to add, we actually were supposed to have a 4th panelist today who couldn't make it from NYSERDA, which I'll just note on this question, they actually have a value stacking pilot project solicitation out right now where they, I think, are supporting up to 50% of system costs for people who prove value stacking, a good value stacking proposition. I think they're currently accepting applications. So John was going to speak to that, but that may be relevant for this audience to actually go look into. Anyone else have a quick point on how different states or ISOs, RTOs are addressing this question? Or what you would maybe like to see certain states and our ISOs do?
Continue doing SGIP across the U.S. It's going to create another economic incentive for people and lower the barrier to entry for people to put storage, make it more economical for a larger group of people to put storage into their homes. Because the last thing we want to do is make it give storage to the rich and make poor people pay for it at the long term. And so we want to make sure that there's economic benefit across everybody. And one way you could do that is creating incentive programs at the state level on top of what we have at the federal level. So that's what I would say.
And Giovanni, could you talk about the project you were working on with NYPA?
Sure. So this kind of ties in with the NYSERDA value stacking grant opportunity. So through a grant with APPA, or the American Public Power Authority, we're working with NYPA to look at their customers, which are munis and co-ops and things, municipal type customers like water treatment facilities, other critical facilities like hospitals, police stations, fire stations, looking across the state of New York, using a database that NYPA brings to the table, which is NIAM, New York Energy Manager, and leverage that with our EPRI's Storage Vet tool to help with screening of where the best opportunities are across the state for energy storage, and what those opportunities look like in terms of, very specifically, value stacking and what the economics look like. So it's a combination of focusing on customers across the state, and then leveraging a very rich data set, and then an analytical framework that stacks value and does it in a methodical way that takes into account not just the value, but the constraints, the specifications, and the requirements.
Right, so we're really putting some meat around the value stacking discussion here. Another question, how is value aggregated customer side of the meter storage different from valuing individual projects? How is valuing aggregated customer side of the meter storage different from individual projects?
Want to take that one?
Sure. Well, in our analysis approach, it doesn't. You don't necessarily need to take a different framework, but potentially it does open up the opportunity for more effective deployment of energy storage. So there may be opportunities to have in aggregate a little bit less energy storage capacity than if you just took all the individual projects and just modeled and designed around each individual project and looking at it in aggregate. But in terms of what it can do for the grid, I think it can just more effectively do what we're seeing is more effectively do everything that an individual project potentially could.
And the other part is security. And I know a lot of this doesn't really come up in a lot of the discussions, but from a national security perspective, when you have distributed assets, it's very difficult to target any single one of them. When you have substation level or single project level type storage, it can be targeted easily. There's 55,000 substations in the US, and all you have to do is target 9 of them on a hot day to take down the entire national grid for months. And so when you have a distributed network of storage and consumption, rather than having your typical pipeline of generation, transmission, consumption, you create less way, you make it more difficult for any single one area to be targeted. So in addition to that, you create more efficiency around the grid because you're not transmitting over long distances.
With our last remaining minutes, just a reminder, it's gtm.cnf.io to submit questions or upvote them. Getting to the last few here, how do you balance the value of the functions in the stack? I.e., do you hold back on less valuable services to ensure your system is ready to provide services that pay better? I imagine there's also a contractual obligations you'd have to fulfill, and this, I guess, gets to the constraints discussion. Does anyone want to, Martin, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, that depends on the contract. That depends on the dynamics of the program and the contractual agreements that you have. It's how you design the program, and there are ways of running multiple programs at the same time. You run them at different priorities. You give them different pricing. I mean, energy, electricity has something to do with time and location for the most part. So, kind of going back to, I think maybe dovetailing to or maybe not dovetailing, but going back to the last question, this is something that sort of kind of goes back to how do you look at the premise? How do you make sure the premise is efficient? Each premise is often different. Each household could be different. So you sort of kind of want to optimize at that level and then come back up. So it's kind of a bottom-up model as opposed to the top-down model, which it sounds a little bit crazy, but that's what Thomas Edison thought he should be doing 100 years ago, so on and so forth, as opposed to top-down, which is what was the AC model as opposed to the DC model. So this is going back. Again, I think each case is different, and each program would be different, and potentially different types of people are going to opt into different types of programs. It depends.
Are there technological barriers to balancing all these different things, or is it just a matter of knowing what they are? And
it's a matter of knowing what they are and what the priority is of the customer, and making sure that you meet the expectations of that customer. Because again, like what Martin was saying, it's just really putting. If backup priority is their number one concern, it's making sure that you have power and energy available to them in those situations where there isn't any. Or if they want to have a higher rate of return for that system, you make sure that that system is providing them the highest rate of return possible. And really it depends on what the utility rates are, what is if there's a net energy metering agreement, if there is a number. Really it depends on what the customer wants, and figuring out where do you place that priority within the value stack, and what the expectations are that you set with them.
Mm-hmm. I would say it also gets back to you could start making value stacking a dirty word again if you don't satisfy the requirements of the various values. So having a clear framework to decide, when you have an anchor service such as deferral that's for safety and reliability, that has to be met. If it doesn't, the line melts or something else bad happens. So that's like you have your hierarchy of things that have to be done, and then you can fill in economically with the other secondary services. And that comes into just satisfying constraints and the rules of the program or the market.
Very well
service
said.
you provide.
But it's often, I mean, obviously there's a little bit of discussion around, people are gonna, it's, in our view, it's gonna be a fire and forget. People sort of kind of understand what the program is and they fire and they forget. They're not gonna constantly sit there and say, oh, well, look, I'm not doing this, I'm
There
gonna
has to be
opt out, or,
automation.
I'm gonna, for the most part, I don't know what kind of, phone service I have, but I read it once. I don't remember it, but
It works.
it works, and I don't question it.
So, all right, I think we've proven that there's some value in the value stacking discussion. It is not just hype. However, that's an interesting point that if not done well, this could become a dirty term again. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you guys for your attention.
Thanks, guys.